Hello everyone and welcome back to my Magic the Gathering Commander Deck List Reviews. So this is a series where I either go through my own personal Commander decks or those submitted by users and kind of break them down to their core mechanics. I'll talk about the Commander, what the deck's generally trying to do, give my critiques, and then wrap it all up with my feedback at the end. If you want to get your own deck list reviewed, make sure to head up to the top link in the description to get your deck reviewed personally by me. With all that out of the way, let's get into today's review. So this is another Final Fantasy Commander. I've been on a big kick with these a lot lately. I think there's a lot of really cool ones coming out with the set. It's a really awesome set, albeit fairly expensive and sort of hard to get your hands on. But Choco, I think, is a really fun one here. So Choco, Seeker of Paradise, is a Bant Commander, 4 mana, 3/5. Bant, by the way, is green, white, and blue. It's a legendary creature bird. These kind of are weird birds because they don't fly, but they do have usually a landfall ability. So it's got landfall whenever a land you control enters. Choco gets +1/+0 until end of turn, which is kind of the whole thing with Chocobos specifically, is just they have some sort of landfall trigger, and it's usually +1/+0. So you get something kind of different, which I think is kind of fun with birds that we really haven't had before. The main thing with Choco, though, is its first ability. So whenever one or more birds you control attack, you look at that many cards from the top of your library. You may put one of them into your hand, then put any number of land cards from among them onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest into your graveyard. So there's kind of a lot going on there. There's a lot of different things that this deck wants from us and a lot of different ways you can kind of go about it. But Choco basically says, hey, attack with a bunch of birds. You get one card, so kind of a card advantage off of it, into your hand. All the lands you immediately get on the battlefield as ramp, and the rest go into your graveyard. So the way this works, you can kind of go a lot of different ways with it. Of course, it's landfall. That's kind of the main thing with the deck, and a lot of the birds, specifically the Chocobo from this set, want to do landfall stuff. But you could do a variety of different things. Because you're putting something in the graveyard, you could do kind of more towards Reanimator if you wanted to, by, reanimating birds and that sort of thing. We aren't the best colors for Reanimator. We can get a lot of stuff back to our hand. And sort of going towards that landfall aspect, you could, Crucible Worlds, that sort of thing, especially if you're playing like the more extensive land base with like fetches and that sort of thing. You could even just choose to put lands into the graveyard. We could do a lot of untapped shenanigans with lands because they do enter tapped. And I think we are running Splunking in the deck, if I'm not mistaken, or just those sort of effects, even if it's not in the deck, are pretty good for what we're doing. Amulet of Vigor, that sort of thing, where we can lands enter untapped, because then it's a whole lot more advantage immediately with the thing that we're doing. And then birds, of course, is the main thing. We're kind of bird triable. And speaking of, we've got 16 actual birds in the deck. Another weird thing that a lot of these Chocobo do also create 2/2 Chocobo creature tokens. So tokens is kind of another aspect of it. There's, Chocobo just came out with Final Fantasy. It's probably the one time we're going to see the mechanic. So there's only so much support for the specific stuff that they're doing. Of course, landfall is a very well-known archetype that has a lot of support, but the tokens, I don't even know if there's a dozen cards that make these specific tokens. So it's kind of a hard thing to super build around. We do have a lot of stuff that makes bird tokens. And another weird part about this deck is the fact that, we want birds to fly, and birds want birds to fly, or at least flying creatures in general, they kind of care about. So there's some kind of weird incongruencies with the deck, but I don't think it's too horrible. I think for the most part, you can kind of get around it. In this deck specifically, I would consider more towards a bracket 2 deck. It does run, I think, crop rotation, because that just became a game changer, though we don't even have anything super crazy in the land base. It's kind of just another way to get a landfall trigger, really. So I wouldn't really consider that. You could take that out of there if you really care about the specific adherence to 3 game changers or less, as a bracket 3 deck. But otherwise, I would consider this around bracket 2, just because it's birds for one, which is not a super strong archetype anyway. But we kind of got a weird thing going on. I think it can be really cool as well. And of course, like I said, if you got a more expensive land base, this becomes a lot better, because fetches, always just give you a bunch of more extra landfall. If you go towards more landfall stuff and kind of get away from the bird tribal, of course, it becomes more powerful, just because, like I said before, it's a very supported archetype. What we're doing here, we really want to do birds. That's kind of the main thing. Really get a lot of stuff off of Choco's attack trigger, and that's kind of the main premise of what we got here. So board wipes, we're not doing a whole lot. Farewell, I think it was kind of flavorful, not only because, it's a Final Fantasy card, but it's a fairly good card for what we're doing. Just a good board wipe, you might as well. And I think with the reprint, card prices dropping, you pick this up while you can, to kind of keep the deck. I can't say super budget, we're running around 300 here. Though a lot of that is because some of the new Final Fantasy stuff is a little expensive, like Traveling Chocobo, of course, in the deck. We've got a few bombs in here that you could totally remove and very much make this more budget if you wanted to. Besides that, it's really not that expensive of a deck to build, because birds are only only so good. There's a few birds that are just expensive because they're just good cards, but besides that, it's not a whole lot. One of our other sort of bombs kind of got a reprint, so it dropped a little bit in price, is Raise the Palisade. So you choose a creature type, return all creatures that aren't of the chosen type to their owner's hand. So it's just a way for us to sort of one-sided board wipe for 5 mana, which is kind of cool, especially with the fact that since we get to keep our board state, being able to attack out for free is also kind of a big thing, because we are sort of an attacking deck, not hugely for what it's worth. Like in Bant, of course, only has so many like tactics that we can use that are in Bant colors, but it's not really a big deal. Most of the time our birds are getting fairly big off of what we're doing, or we have pump effects, that sort of thing. You can also run more of that in here to kind of get that. So that's just kind of a nice way to not only get the board wipe, but has that double effect of also allowing us to get in with our creatures on the flip side. In terms of card advantage, so of course our commander is a huge source of card advantage for our deck. We're getting to look at a lot of cards, with its ability, and then we're getting to put one to hand, a bunch of stuff on the battlefield. So we're getting a lot off of that. So we don't have a whole lot of card advantage in the deck. You can always run more. We're in blue. You can run a whole bunch. You can run your Brainstorm, Preordained Spawners, or whatever. But for what we're doing, just kind of a few different things. So Curiosity Crafter is a really cool one. So it's a 4 mana bird wizard, flying 3/3. Says you have no max hand size, which is kind of nice. Just a good thing to have. But really the big thing is whenever a creature token you control deals common damage to a player, you draw a card. So like I said, there's sort of a sub thing with Chocobo that makes tokens, and there are a few just bird creators that we have in the deck as well. And you can run more in here. I'm not running a whole lot of the bird creators. There's not a whole lot to even run. I just kind of picked the few that I think were the best and the easiest to play with, because there's a few cards even with the Chocobo creators that just aren't that good. So kind of just one of those things, but I think that's a pretty nice one. Just get a little, having the bird and then just getting a little bit of extra card draw when you do hit with them. Distant Melody, kind of just a good staple card for any tribal deck in blue. 4 mana sorcery, choose a creature type, draw a card to each permanent you control of that type. This has kind of got a weird wording. If you somehow had a non-creature bird, this is just all permanents of the type. You could technically draw off that, but there's very few like tribal, typal, kindred, whatever cards that I don't even think there's one that is a bird that is a non-creature permanent. But for some archetypes that does end up mattering. But for the most part, it's like you really want to be drawing. If this is a harmonize, it's still kind of bad. But if you can draw, pay 4 for 4, I think that's where this card is kind of getting okay. Besides that, it's just kind of a neat little draw spell, kind of synergizes what we're doing. Frantic Search, another one I always like to run on these decks. Kind of synergizes well with what we're doing as well. So 3 mana instant, draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, untap 3 lands. So this can be kind of nice for not only mana fixing is kind of a big thing. It's good for hand fixing as well, drawing, discarding, the Faithless Looting type thing. We're getting kind of Sculptor hand off of that. And with some of these decks, depending on what lands you're running. Like if you're running any soul lands, like Temple of the False God or anything like that, or Ancient Tomb, where your lands are tapping for more than 1 mana, this can sort of be a ritual effect because it's just untapping 3 lands. So you could pay 3, cast this, untap 3 lands. When those tap for more, you're getting more mana out of that. But besides that, this can be kind of nice because our commander puts stuff onto the battlefield to tap. So if you did have something, even with something that had like some sort of ability you wanted to use, let's say you got a Rogue's Passage. I mean, it's a little late for a Rogue's Passage, but anything with an activated ability you'd want to use, that's another way you can use this as well. We're just a lands matter deck, so that kind of stuff matters a whole lot more for what we're doing. Or, if you do end up getting a fetch land off of its ability, that's another great thing to use it for. Being able to untap those to immediately use the ability even after that trigger, that's kind of nice as well. But all around, I just really like Frantic Search. I like how it's a mana neutral card, so you can immediately, play it, get your stuff back, and kind of keep going. So it allows you to double spell a lot more on your turns. Ledger Shredder, one of the few just good bird cards that we have in here. So it's a flying 2 mana with 1/3. But big thing here is whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, it connives. So you draw a card and discard a card. If it's a non-land card, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Most of the time, I don't think we even have lands in hand because we're trying to play a whole bunch of them. But just another thing, gives us a good amount of card advantage. Not really card advantage. Again, it's card selection. I like making that distinction because card advantage really is when you are netting cards. So like Distant Melody, if you're able to draw at least 2 cards off Distant Melody, you're trading the 1 card that you're casting to get 2 cards. That's advantage. So a lot of this is just card, hand sculpting. which is still very good, especially with Ledger Shredder triggering off of any player casting their spell, so we can trigger it ourselves. So if you Ledger Shredder into Frantic Search or something, you're getting Connive Trigger. Of course, it also grows it, which is kind of cool. It gets down very early in the game. We only have so many kind of cheap birds we get to play, and other players doing stuff, it also gets to grow. So that's kind of the big thing in here. Tatyova is one of our good, just generic landfall pieces in here because, you kind of need some of this stuff just if you're running a landfall deck. And of course, as landfall, whenever land enters, you gain 1 life and draw a card. So that's the big thing here, is just the card advantage is really great with that, especially when we have Choco out and we're getting that trigger. All the lands we get to put down, we're immediately drawing again after that as well. So very synergistic for the exact thing we're doing. A winged portent. So this is kind of a weird one from Crimson Vow. Has Cleave, which I don't think we're almost ever paying for. Cleave just says you get to play an alternative cost, and when you do, you get to cut out the bracketed text. So for the normal card, just says draw a card for each creature with flying you control, and if you cleave it for 6 mana instead of 3, you draw a card for each creature you control instead. But of course, if you're trying to get the cleave off, that's not very good for what we're doing. Really care about just the regular draw 3 for each pay 3 mana to draw a card for each creature you control that's flying. Which, like I said, a lot of our birds have flying, a lot of our creatures do. So we're usually getting, if you can get, if this is a divination, that's kind of okay. But really, I think if you're paying a mana per card you're drawing, that's kind of where the rate is the best, and and more. It's instant speed, which is also kind of nice. You get a little bit more off that. Winged Words is exactly that. So it's normally a 3 mana sorcery that draws you 2 cards, so divination. But it has this spell cost 1 less to cast if you control a creature with flying, which most of the time we should. So 2 mana draw 2, just good. Interaction, we're again not super high in interaction. I kind of just threw in a lot of stuff that was bird related and kind of it with the deck. Even Mind Sensor is a good bird, and I like a lot of the birds with flash. That's kind of a nice thing with the deck because we are trying to attack with birds. So sort of giving them pseudo haste, where you play them on an opponent's end step, you untap. It's been there since the beginning of your turn, so it doesn't have summoning sickness. That can be nice. But even Mind Sensor is just a good gotcha card because it has flash. If an opponent would search your library, search their library, that player searches the top 4 cards instead, so it kind of just shuts off tutors in general, and that's why it's great. It has flash, so some vampiric tutors, mystical tutors, tutor what in any sort of way, you can immediately shut that off, and it doesn't shut off your tutors, which is also really nice. But besides that, it's just a good bird, and is what you want to do. One of our new includes from the actual set that this is from is Bart's and Boko. So it is kind of an interesting one. It's got affinity for birds. So it costs 1 less for each bird you control. So if you have at least 3 birds, it only costs green, which just green for a 4/3 bird would be a good enough turn in this deck, honestly. But it does have an ETB that says whenever Bart's and Boko enters, each other bird you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls. So you're kind of just able to sort of remove a creature most of the time. Even if you got the 3 birds out to reduce this to 2, you're getting this down, and that's each other bird, so it does not include itself. But it is kind of the one. It's a weird kind of card where it makes the other stuff do damage to a creature, but most of the time your birds are going to be 2/2s, 3/3s, whatever. A good enough point to where most creatures are getting able to remove from the bird. So not only are we getting something down, we're also able to kind of get that off and use it as a removal spell, which is kind of just extra. Honestly, Beast Within, you could run a whole bunch of these. There's so many, Generous Gift, just destroy permanent stuff. I just think it's kind of nice to have. Just kind of threw it in here because you kind of need that kind of thing. And I say this with a lot of these. Interaction, you could definitely go way more on. I don't run a whole lot of interaction with my decks, just because I don't have a super interaction heavy meta. So it's not as huge a deal for me to have a whole lot of these cards. But I think for what this is, we have a good amount of interaction, but this is definitely something you can pump up more heavily, especially like for the few comment tricks that Bant can use, like Reconnaissance would be very easy to include if you wanted to in this deck. Very cheap card to also throw in here. I was kind of getting to the point where cutting was a little difficult because you also have to run so many lands and you want to run so many birds, and so you kind of gotta, make sure you can sculpt correctly. But I think if you wanted to do that, any sort of the interaction that has to do with combat or giving stuff indestructible or unblockable, that sort of thing is probably a good idea as well in terms if you want to kind of upgrade and shift this around. Dawn's Truce, a good card. It's got a bird on it, which I thought was kind of cool. So it's got gift a card, so you can promise a card to someone else as you cast this, and you get an extra effect. It's 2 mana instant that says you and permanents you control can hexproof on a turn, and if the gift was promised, permanents you control also get indestructible on a turn. So this is just kind of a better heroic intervention, very easy one to cast, and the gifting is way better in Commander than it is in 1v1 format, because 1v1 it's just a straight up, hey, the person I'm trying to kill, I'm giving extra advantage to with this, so it's a way heavier cost. But most of the time in Commander, there's one person that's more behind, or there's always someone that's not the threat at the moment, or not as equally the threat, so you can kind of give the card to someone and they get as little less advantage comparatively to a 1v1 format, which I like. So card doesn't matter as much to give, and you get giving yourself just hexproof can be nice. If someone's got a Jessica's Will and they target you with it or something like that, giving yourself hexproof can matter a whole lot for that sort of thing as well. Dazzling Denial, so this is our bird counterspell. So it's a 2-mana instance, says counter target spell unless its controller pays 2. If you control a bird, counter that spell unless its controller pays 4 instead. So most of the time, that's, it is a mana leak sort of effect, but most of the time that's just going to be a straight up counter spell. Most people can't pay the 4, and they're going to have to pay the 4 most of the time because we're going to be controlling birds more than likely on our turns when we cast this. So and just another flavorful one for what we're doing. We've also got Path to Exile in here. You could be running swords as well. It's very easy to. We are running a few more counter spells, so that's why I'm not running as much just straight up removal, because we have other ways to deal with that. Path to Exile is pretty good. I do like Path to Exile more than Swords to Plowshares in this deck specifically, because there are times every now and again I have used Path to Exile on my own stuff, like a token or something throwaway, to get an extra land out, and if you really needed to, you could use this as sort of a ramp piece. It's very weird and definitely not the way you always want to be playing this card, but we're running a lot of landfall stuff, so if you really needed to, you could run this as an extra landfall trigger to do any sort of thing that would matter for. That's kind of just a weird random tech that I don't think is super optimal most of the time. Like getting rid of one of your own creatures, kind of 2-for-1ing yourself isn't super great, but it can now and then end up being the thing that you need. So that's kind of just on top of that pretty good. And sometimes blocking or getting rid of like an 8/8, a 10/10 or whatever, some giant thing, and having your opponent gain that much life can be a whole lot worse than just giving them a land, especially later on in the game. And then sort of the duo here, we've got Swan Song and Strix Serenade as our other counter spells, because of course they're also bird counter spells, so they're kind of just opposites of each other. So Swan Song was the first one, 1-mana blue instant, says counter target enchantment, instant or sorcery spell, its controller creates a 2/2 bird creature token with flying. And Strix Serenade has the other types, it's counter target artifact, creature, or planeswalker spell, and then they also create a 2/2 with flying. So kind of just our two cool ones. Another kind of bomb unit, that's $10 card with Swan Song, but I think if it's so well in here, it's definitely worth including. And Strix Serenade can also be kind of a nice one, just hitting all the types off these two cards, and of course the counterspell for 1 mana, especially when it nets, especially more so with Swan Song, it gets the best sort of types that we're looking for with instant sorcery, especially getting rid of rads or even countering a counterspell, that sort of thing. Just to kind of round out our interaction pieces here. But like I said, you can run a whole bunch more if you want to. In terms of lands, we've got 40 in here because we are a landfall deck, so you want to have the lands to hit, especially because, even with normal landfall decks, you may not run 40. Sometimes I just run the base amount depending on the specific thing that you're trying to do with your lands. But with this deck, we are wanting to find them off the top, and so having more of our deck percentagely be lands is just better for what we're doing. We just want to see more of them as we're, drawing those cards off of that, or at least revealing those cards. We've got a few interesting ones, so most of them are kind of just our budget good lands. So like our Tingle lands, we've got our Pain lands, Command Tower, Exotic Orchard. We got our 1 fetch and Fabled Passage, and I've already said this before, but landfall decks love having extra tutors if you can add them in here, but that's definitely kind of salt the taste or salt the budget really on there. Speaking of, we are also running the Verges. I felt like that was kind of a necessary include. Not completely, but if I can, I try not to run almost any tapped lands, especially because our stuff already comes in tapped. So when we can have stuff enter untapped, that's way better, especially because our commander costs 4 mana, so we're wanting to get stuff out as soon as possible. We got slow lands as well in here. Though on the flip side of that is also the fact that because our lands are entering tapped off of our commander, a lot of times it may not matter as much to you to have tapped lands, because if that's what they're already doing anyway most of the time, either way, having them enter untapped a lot of times may not matter. But I still think having them untapped for most situations just ends up being better. We've got a few weird ones. So Path of Ancestry, just kind of good. We got both Secluded Courtyard and Unclaimed Territory to name birds, which is kind of cool. We got this very specific kind of weird one, Seaside Haven. I never even seen this one before building this deck. So it adds a colorless mana, or you can pay Azorius, tap it, and sacrifice a bird to draw a card. So that's kind of another cool kind of weird one in here. We've got Reliquary Tower. I like these Tranquil Landscape, or just the landscape lands, I think is what they are. The ones from Modern Horizons that are the 3 land types, they're very good for the decks. They're basically just better evolving wilds because they can just sit there on the battlefield and add colorless mana if you want to. They cycle as well, and then you can also grab one of the basics that those lands could grab you anyway with its second ability. So this is just kind of a thing that you can use and then sack as a fetch land if you really want to. But I know I'm just a big fan of what they are for all budget decks especially. Another one of our sort of expensive cards in here is Sparta's Headquarters. Because we are running a bunch of the Verges and these check lands and the Tangle lands and all of that, having the Tri-land is kind of just huge for the deck. Being able to immediately turn on everything is just really good for what we're doing. Kind of nice there. Windbrisk Heights, I like these sort of cards as well. The Hideaways I think are really cool. You could run more Hideaways cards in here if you wanted to. I think this one's really good because we're an attack deck, so Hideaway, of course, is just the ability, with this one specifically, it has Hideaway 4. It says when this line enters, look at the top 4 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, then put the rest on the bottom in a random order. It taps for a white, and you can pay white and tap it. You may play the exile card without paying its mana cost if you attack with at least 3 more creatures this turn. So most of the time, that's what we're trying to do, is attack with a whole bunch of creatures. So this is really easy to turn on. And, gives us something free on top of that. So just a lot of, especially because we are a lands deck, getting to put lands on the battlefield that have extra utility is also very good. Celupide Village. So this one can add a colorless or white to cast creature spells, which, that's most of the time what we're going to be using this with. Or you can pay 2 and sack it to look at the top 6 cards of your library. You can reveal a bat, bird, mouse, or rabbit card from among them, put it into your hand. Bird, of course, is the thing we're looking for, so kind of just a little bit of extra card advantage on top of that is kind of nice. And I do like this one can also tap for color mana if we need it to, and it doesn't enter tapped, so it's kind of just most of the time just a regular plains that has an extra ability on top of it, which is really nice. You use tier it, so this enters tapped unless you control a legendary creature. You can also pay 2 and tap it to draw a card, activated only if you attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn. Again, another thing we're going to be triggering a whole lot, so easy to get to. Reliquary Tower, a bunch of, the normal stuff. Yavi Maya, kind of at the end here just because turning on, our stuff is pretty good. Having green at all times, we're a very big green deck. We have a lot of that kind of stuff in here. Birds and just landfall in general likes to be more towards like green and blue, especially green because that's just kind of where our good stuff is. So having that as well to just make sure we have our mana fixed is kind of nice. I guess in here as well, we have Restless Anchorage, and this is a really cool one, because it is one of the animate lands from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. You can pay 3 and have it, until end of turn, become a 2/3 white and blue bird creature token with flying. It's still a land. When it attacks, creates a map token. What we really care about here with this, though, is the fact that it becomes a bird creature. So that's really nice. There's a few other you could run. There is a few changeling lands you can run that can, you can animate and that are birds as well that you can throw in here just to, get your bird count up and be able to attack with it if you need to. I think that's kind of nice, having that little bit of extra there. So you can kind of get a little more utility out of that, and it kind of can count this as a bird card, but I just thought that was kind of fun. On top of everything else, you get to have birds in your lands as well. Kind of playing birds for free in a way. Ramp, we have a whole lot of ramp because we are a lands deck. We want to get a whole bunch of land triggers. Our only mana rocks we're running in here are Arcane Signet, Soaring, and then Urza's Incubator is kind of a mana rock as well. So everyone knows those two. Urza's Incubator, you choose a creature type when it enters, and the creatures of the chosen type cost 2 less to cast. So this is sort of an older card, at least the original printing was, and so it just says creature spells in general of the type cost 2 less to cast, so it is universal. That means that opponents also get this effect, which is why for specific decks like human decks or wizard decks, this is not the best card to be running in those, because human and wizard and that sort of thing, like the general kind of generic card types, are so abundant that this helps opponents a lot more than you'd really want it to. You kind of got to be careful of these symmetrical effects. But birds, there's not very many birds in the game. At least good birds that most people are running. Like you might see a Ledger Shredder every now and again that gets reduced by 1, but even then not really. So this is way better in our deck because we are running sort of an uncommon creature type with our deck, and so we're getting a lot more value out of this without providing our value to the opponent as well. Of course, the bird really I think you're going to be seeing in any deck is Birds of Paradise that also already can't be reduced, but great for the deck. It's a flyer, which we definitely care about, and of course there's a mana dork. Crop rotation, kind of already talked about it already, but it's a 1 mana green instant. You can sacrifice a land to search all your friendly and put on the battlefield tapped. So this is a way to get your specific lands out. This is really great with the more utility lands that you play. You know, if you play something, I mean, the top end being like a Graia's Cradle or something crazy, but even just little stuff, like even if you're able to do that like Yavi Maya just to, you know, fix all your colors, or if you want the Restless Anchorage to have an extra bird out, you can kind of just grab what you need with this, which I really like about it. Cultivate, Farseek, you know, Harrow, Nature's Lore, Sky Shard Claim, just our ways to get non-basics out, which is kind of nice because, like I said, we're running a few of the Tango lands. We have our Tri lands, so we're able to grab that kind of stuff in here. Growth Spile, we can play an extra land basically on our turn. Draws this card as well, just kind of an explore on top of everything else. Speaking of explore, we have Exploration, 1 mana enchantment that just allows us to play extra lands on our turns, which I think is kind of just a nice effect. You don't need a whole lot of these in the deck. I don't think it's really not a big deal, especially with how many other tutors we're playing in the deck. We do have some interesting stuff in here that could, you know, be a little bit more value off of that, but I don't really think we have too many landfall triggers outside of, you know, our little birds that it really matters to have a lot of extra. Honestly, just having a whole bunch of mana is great for this deck, not only because our commander already costs 4 mana and we want to be able to fix that, but we do like casting a whole lot of birds all at once. You know, we're kind of mana hungry in that way, so just having lands that way. You could add like a Summer Bloom if you wanted to have, you know, extra land drops that way, but for this deck specifically, we're not running Skewed Swarms or Avengers Zendikar, that sort of thing, so having a whole bunch of extra land drops in one turn is not a huge deal, but getting, you know, these kind of explosive starts with a lot of our, you know, land tutors can be nice. We got Gilded Goose in here, sort of just another Birds of Paradise effect. When I just create a food token, then you can sacrifice a food, add 1 mana of any color. Sort of a one-time bird effect, but you can also pay 2 mana to tap it to create a food token if you wanted to. But most of the time, it's just another birds that has a one-time mana effect. We have talked about Spelunking a little bit. It is a really great card to have in the deck. So when it enters, you draw a card, and then you put a land card from here on the battlefield. If it was a cave, you put it on the battlefield this way, you gain 4 life. That doesn't ever matter. You do get a card draw when it enters, which is kind of cool. But the bottom text is kind of what matters. So lands you control enter the battlefield untapped. Very synergistic with our commander. And, you know, you could run like Amulet of Vigor effects. It's very good for this deck, running a whole lot of those that I know. Like Amulet of Vigor kind of has gotten expensive, so just running this by itself is kind of nice. Not only does it cantrip itself, but it's a very cheap effect, you know, it's not even a $2 card. Very easy to run in this type of deck for not a whole lot of expense, and is very, very vital to what we're doing and kind of accelerates this a whole lot. Not only being able to get, you know, play all our stuff, get the Choco trigger, put a whole bunch of stuff down, you know, off of whatever we're doing, but it kind of gives us a lot of times even close to a second turn with, you know, depending on how many creatures we're attacking with, which is really, really cool. Chalice Provisioner, one of our other few landfalls cards in the game. Not cards in the game. Chalice Provisioner, one of our other few landfall cards in the deck. Whenever land you control enters, you can either create a food or a treasure token. So I didn't specifically add Lotus Cobra in this deck, even though, you know, it's a pretty good landfall card for the most part. But the problem with any sort of Lotus Cobra effect in this deck, where, you know, enters, creates a mana of any color, or like Nissa is another one, it's not very good in this deck because when we're getting landfall triggers a whole lot with the deck is when we are trying to put them into the battlefield during our combat. And there's very few ways, you know, unless you have instant speed stuff, that you're able to use that mana during combat. So Lotus Cobra is just, it's good, you know, it's still a great card. Allows you to, you know, kind of play a whole bunch of extra stuff just during your normal turn, but we get a whole lot less value out of it in this specific deck because that's where we're getting all our landfall triggers. So having something like a Chalice Provisioner, where instead of just adding a mana to our mana pool that we float, gives us a treasure token in permanent form, so we can save that mana for later on. And it kind of has, you know, if you wanted to, has that sort of weird synergy with Gilded Goose where you can make more food tokens to fuel Gilded Goose to keep tapping for mana. Though most of the time, almost all of the time, you're going to be just making treasure tokens, which by itself is good enough. We've got a few more cost reducers in here. So Watcher of the Spheres, another bird. Creatures you control with flying you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever another creature enters with flying, it gets +1/+1 on turn. Really doesn't matter, it's just 2/2 reduce our stuff by 1. Warden of the Evos Isle. 3-mana 2/2 flyer, creates a creature spells with flying you cast cost 1 to cast. So just kind of the same thing, slightly more expensive, but you know they're just both flyers by themselves, flying birds, which turns on a lot of stuff in our deck, and then they reduce the cost of our other birds. So kind of just on top of everything else, good little includes in here, very easy to run, and definitely help the deck a whole lot. Kind of talked about it a little bit. We got tokens in here. Not a whole lot. There's just in general not a whole lot of specifically the 2/2 bird with landfall tokens in the game in general, and not a whole lot of bird token creators either. But there are a few that are really good. So Choco's Racetrack is an extremely good one. Just has landfall. Whenever land enters, you make one of those 2/2 tokens. So this is probably our best token creator in the deck because we care about the specific birds that we're creating because they have the landfall triggers, which is really, really nice. And the landfall is kind of just great off of what we're doing. And we do have a few ways to get this into our hand a lot easier than other cards. We have a few tutor effects, but I really like this. And of course it has the very awesome flavor of being a Choco card from the new set. A Merry Angel, so one of our few non-bird creatures in the deck. One landfall, whenever land enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 white bird creature talking with flying. So in some ways can even be better than Choco Racetrack just because it comes down for 1 less, and landfall creates you a flying bird, which can be nice. Though ups and downs, you know, having the landfall, so every time we're attacking, we get more value off of them, and we can pump them a lot more, can be kind of nice, but just getting flyers can matter for a lot of our deck anyway. Both good includes. I think they're definitely worth running, and of course, very cheap to run. Flurry of Wings, so this is one of our other kind of weird ones I'm glad we get to play in this deck. So Cause Exactly Bant, and it's an instant. It says put X 1/1 white bird soldier creature tokens with flying into play, or X the number of attacking creatures. So that's kind of nice, kind of a weird old text, but just whenever you attack with stuff, which is of course what we're doing a whole lot of the time, we get that, you can play this and get that many extra birds. They don't enter tap in the attacking or anything, but you do get a whole, you know, you get to basically double the number of creatures you control, which I find is really cool. Kind of nice just for, you know, the thing, and of course they're flyers, which can matter a whole lot for not only attacking, which, you know, that's something I haven't really talked about a whole lot, but the flying birds are really nice because they can get through a lot easier being flyers themselves. But again, we have a lot of stuff that cares about flying creatures on our battlefield, so that's another big thing. But just this is kind of a good, the fact that instant speed is kind of nice as well. But kind of just a good card for what it is to really pump up our board state when we need it. Nesting Dovehawk, another one that really is begging for a reprint. It hasn't seen one in a minute, so it's kind of gotten expensive, but it's a very good bird for what we're doing. So it's a 4/4, it's a 2/2 with flying, cost 4. It says at the beginning of comment on your turn, you populate, so you create a token that's a copy of creature token you control, which very awesome for what we're doing, especially if you can copy something like one of our landfall 2/2s. And then whenever creature token enters the battlefield under your control, it gets a +1/+1 counter. So this is kind of everything. I think this is one of the better cards in the deck because not only does it give us a whole bunch of extra tokens, it's also a bird and triggers off of tokens. So this kind of does the whole thing, cares about pretty much everything we're doing besides landfall. So I really like this one. Again, kind of a more expensive card to run in here, but I think it's very, very good for what we're doing, and kind of one of the more vital cards, I would say, for the specific archetype we're going for. And now we've got Side Quest, Raise a Chocobo. So this is a 2-mana enchantment. It says when it enters, you create one of those 2/2 bird creature tokens. At the beginning of your first main phase, if you control 4 or more birds, you transform it. So that's, you know, completing the side quest. In the back, we've got Black Chocobo. So this one's also very good. Whenever this permanent transforms into Black Chocobo, you search your library for a land card, put on the battlefield, tap, and then shuffle. The big thing here just says a land card. It's not a basic, which, you know, I'd assume this was most of the time. So you can grab anything, grab your Yavimaya or any of your, you know, your big good lands, you know, utility type stuff. And then it also has landfall, but its landfall is way better. It says whenever a land you control enters, birds you control get +1/+0 to end a turn. So it's not just itself, it pumps everything, which is awesome when we do combine that effect with any of our flyers, because, you know, that's kind of the competing thing here is not only are these 2/2s instead of 1/1s, they also have the landfall trigger, so they get a lot, you know, bigger power-wise and synergize with a lot of the stuff we're doing in the deck comparatively to the flyers. The flyers, of course, have evasion, and we synergize with flying with a lot of our other cards, which is why Black Chocobo is super great, because it kind of does everything. And a lot of times, if you're able to flip this and attack with it with Choco on the same turn with, you know, 3 or 4 birds, you're able to deal a whole lot of damage that exact turn. I think a lot of times this is a game ender, not only because to be able to flip it, you already have to control 4 or more birds. So this would be your 5th bird. So attacking with 5 birds, you're, you know, getting a look at 5, put some lands down, getting a whole bunch of triggers off stuff. And not only that, it also gives you a landfall off of its flip ability. So that by itself is already pumping stuff. So I would say it's not Crater Hoof, but it kind of is our bird Crater Hoof in a way. And just does a lot of cool different stuff. And I like the fact that it also creates its token all around. I think it's just a really good card. Next, we got Summon Fat Chocobo. So this is our one Saga. I know there's a Summon Choco Mog, but that card I just thought was a little too drafty to try to run in a commander deck. But this one's kind of nice because it's one of our other few things that creates tokens. So it's first Saga trigger. And of course, this is the kind of the new thing where we got Saga creatures. So it just does the normal thing as a Saga, but it's also a 5-mana 4/4. So on its first trigger gives us a 2/2. And then its next 3 triggers gives creatures we control trampled on a turn, which is more of the reason why I'm running in the deck, because a lot of times we're not able to get in. You know, we pump the crap out of our creature's power, but if we don't have a way to get through, we don't have any evasion, it's not as good. A lot of birds are going to have evasion built in, but for this, I think it's nice to have the trample. That's another thing you could definitely add to the deck. I've kind of already talked about adding in more combat tricks very easily is a good thing for what we're doing, being able to kind of maneuver around stuff, either give them evasion in general, like a Dolmen Gate sort of thing, or just trample or something like that is very, very good. So having this effect I think is great, because not only does it give us kind of the bird landfall thing, it is a bird, but gives us that evasion on top of it, which is really nice. And Thanos, this is one of our other few non-bird creatures, but it's very, very synergistic. So it says whenever you cast a beast or bird spell, you may copy it, except the copy is an artifact in addition to its other types. So mostly with this, we have very few legendaries in the deck, which is what this is really great for. So whenever we get to cast any of our birds, we get a second bird on top of that. So that's kind of the huge thing with this, is we're getting to double spell off of this. There's a lot of these, like Reflections of Liljara you could add into here, or just stuff that allows you to kind of double cast off of getting our specific creature type. But I think Thanos was kind of just a very fun specific one that was easy to run in here, which is kind of nice. He even works, I think, really well. If you want to cut white, you could definitely run this as a bird chocobo commander as well, which I think is really cool. But just kind of generically, I think a fun one for what we're doing. Now we end here, we do have quite a lot of value, kind of just stuff that doesn't run into any of the other categories, but I think is very good for the deck. Earlier kind of talked, we do have crop rotation as game changer, and I realized I did actually do all 3 game changers, and I kind of try to do, if I'm already immediately going to be putting the deck into bracket 3, you might as well get all 3 game changers in as well. And I think this deck specifically values these because, again, I think lower powered decks, and it's almost oxymoronically, I feel better about putting game changers, or at least tutors, into the decks, because the decks run a lot slower. So having 1 or 2 tutors in the deck where you can grab something pretty okay, I think is always nice, and kind of just allows you to be slightly more efficient, so you can have more fun games, even if you're not efficient where you grab the same thing every time to get the win combo, whatever. Just gives us a little bit more ability to sort of play around, toolbox, whatever the board state is. So Enlightened Tutor is very nice. Search life for an artifact or enchantment, put on top, shuffle. And then Worldly Tutor, search life for a creature, put on top, shuffle. So of course Worldly Tutor is great because we have so many creatures we'd rather have. But Enlightened Tutor is really awesome for the deck, not only because of a lot of these artifacts and enchantments that I will be talking about here, but we've already talked about a few. Really, I think Chocobo Racetrack and Side Quest are 2 of the biggest ones that we'd want to get out, especially Chocobo Racetrack, just because it immediately gives us a whole lot of extra value on what we're doing. There's quite a few artifacts and enchantments in the deck. Even getting an exploration, if you've got a few lands in hand, can be kind of nice on what we're doing. Well, we've got actually quite a few targets for Enlightened Tutor in here, or just kind of bombs for a deck, which is kind of the reason I like it in here. And like I said, Worldly Tutor, there's a lot of creatures that we'd like to get. Like Traveling Chocobo is one of them. Probably just the best bird in the deck, and kind of really this card specifically, or at least pulling one, is what made me want to build the deck, because I think it's just a great card, and it just does everything we're looking for, because it's specifically built for this archetype. So Traveling Chocobo is a 3-mana 3/2 bird, of course. So you may look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may play lands and cast bird spells from the top of your library. So this is kind of a card advantage in a way, because it kind of most of the time gives us an extra card in our hand. I think 56 cards in the deck are going to be either a bird or a land, so it is kind of an extra card. We have sort of an 8-card hand a lot of times with this card, because we get so much off of it, which, just having that is kind of nice, and getting the bird synergy, that by itself would be pretty good. But it also has, and this is the kind of busted part about it, it says if a land or bird you control entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So this is just a straight up Panharmonicon. So all of our effects that would enter, either the landfall stuff or just birds entering for whatever reason, that is just going to double trigger, and that gives us so much extra value. Getting +2/+0 off of every land instead of +1/+0, that is a huge buff for what we're doing and gives us a whole lot of value. It's kind of hard to stress how much this actually does for the deck and how much it will accelerate stuff, but it's a very huge card, and it is probably, I think, one of our most splashy. I think it is just straight up our most splashy card at $30. But it is insanely worth it. I think if you're going to build this deck, even if you're not running any of the other expensive cards, you want to pick this one up just because it's literally the archetype in totality of what we're doing. So very, very good card. Definitely what we're looking for. And usually the bomb we're going to pick with Worldly Tutor or something like that if we have the ability to. Then we have Tutor, so this is another kind of a cool one. One of our few reanimation spells for the deck. So it's a bird, just happens to be, which is kind of the cool thing we're running in here. It's a flyer, but it says whenever you cast a historic spell, which we have a good amount of. Sagas, we do have a few, 1 or 2 saga creatures that we're triggering this off of, legendaries, and our artifact spells. We can return a target creature with mana value 3 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. So this is really nice, and reanimation stuff, if you're going towards more of that sort of end of it, is really nice for what we're doing. With this deck, because we're putting stuff at the graveyard with Choco's ability a lot of times, you can kind of get that card back a lot easier, at least if you're filling your grave. Tutor is really great for that, because a lot of our birds, or just creatures in general in the deck, are 3 or less, so we're able to get those back pretty easily. So we're able to choose other cards, because you do get to pick one card to put in your hand with Choco, so you're kind of getting extra card off of that as well, kind of just making Choco's ability a little bit better for what we're doing. Kind of in a similar vein as Safine's Reclamation. I love this card. I put it in a lot of decks because it just does so much, and I think it has, it provides a whole lot of value, especially because it has flashback. So flashback cards, that's another thing that's really good with this deck. Same thing with can flashback, because of course we're putting stuff to graveyard again, kind of just graveyard synergy. So it says return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from a graveyard to the battlefield. If the spell was cast from a graveyard, you may copy the spell and choose new targets for the copy. So this basically, you can use this up to 3 times, basically. You get the normal one for 3 mana, it hits the bin, and then you can flash it back to get 2 more of it. And this is really good if you've got more fetches in the deck, because that's a permanent with mana value 3 or less. You can immediately return to the battlefield. They don't enter tapped, so you can immediately crack those again if you wanted to. Get a whole bunch of value that way if you really wanted to, though otherwise it's just another thing that's easy to mill for 1 because it has the flashback, but get stuff back off of whatever you mill with Choco. So that's kind of cool with that. We have Saz's Chocobo, so I just thought this was a pretty good one, honestly. I think it's a pretty good card for what we're doing. It's one of our other few 1-mana birds on top of, Birds of Paradise and our Gilded Goose. So it, as landfall, whenever a land enters, instead of getting +1/+0, which I think would be a little too weak for this card, it just gets a +1/+1 counter, which is, I think, honestly, wouldn't have been too bad. The hard thing is this, I always forget that this is a standard set because of how expensive the prices on everything have been and how good a lot of the cards are. Might be a little too powerful for standard, but I think +1/+1 would have been fine for like a commander thing, to make this kind of an archetype that works a little bit better, but just Saz's Chocobo by itself is kind of nice. And on top of everything else, we do have Saz Katsroy, I believe, to kind of have that sort of, his Chocobo is literally sitting in his hand in the artwork, so kind of a fun flavor thing here. But Saz is actually one of our other few tutors in the deck. So when it enters, you may search your library for a bird or basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. And whenever it attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, then double the number of +1/+1 counters on that creature. Most of the time, we're not putting +1/+1 counters on our creatures almost ever, so that part doesn't really matter. But most of it's really because we get the tutor effect, which is kind of nice, and it is a modal tutor, so if you needed lands, you could play that. But most of the time, bird is just going to be better because we have so many birds we want to get out. Though, of course, they synergize together because one of the few creatures in our deck that gets +1/+1 counters is Saz's Chocobo, so kind of a fun thing there if you can get them both on the battlefield. Roaming Throne. Again, a very splashy, sort of expensive card to run on the deck, but kind of need what we can with bird stuff. When it enters, you choose a creature type, and then it is that type in addition to its other types. If a triggered ability of a creature you control of the chosen type triggers, it triggers an additional time. So it's literally, Traveling Chocobo is just ETB triggers of birds or lands entering the battlefield. So it's a little bit different with Traveling Chocobo because it's also doubles land triggers. But Roaming Throne is just all bird triggers. So it doesn't have to be an ETB trigger. Something like Castrol that has a damage trigger, you get an additional trigger of, which is really cool. Just sort of that sort of thing. So you get a little bit of cast trigger off of Tutor, you get double triggers on. So Roaming Throne is just kind of nice on top of that. And then it becomes a bird that you can swing in if you want to. So kind of another thing on top of that, we really want these pieces in here if we can, because we want to get maximum value out of the birds that we have in the deck, since we only have so many to choose from. Next, we have Mockingbird. So Mockingbird, again, just happens to be a bird, but it's also a clone effect. So it is an X blue 1/1 flyer, and says you may have it enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield with mana value less than or equal to the amount of mana spent to cast Mockingbird, except it's a bird in addition to its other types and has flying. So this is really nice because it can copy anything on the battlefield. So, you know, if someone has a really good creature you want to be able to copy, you can copy that. But the cool thing with Mockingbird is it stays a flying bird. So, of course, we really care about having flying and the bird creature type with our cards. So this is not just a generic clone to add to the deck. It actually synergizes extremely well with what we're doing. And if you really wanted to, you could totally have this enter, just pay the 1 mana, have it enter as one of our 1-drops if we have it. Or it's equal or less than mana value. So you could, if you wanted to, also just have this enter as one of our bird tokens that gets pumped every turn. And that by itself would be good enough as well, I think. But again, kind of just a toolbox card. Very nice for the specific situations we might need it for. Lightning Greaves. So there's not a lot of haste to be seen in Bant. You could run like Concordant Crossroads. I don't really recommend it. Only time I would really run Concordant Crossroads in a deck is when you have like 1 turn you need to swing out with. If you're making, a billion tokens in that 1 turn, you're like, okay, I have a Skewed Storm or whatever. I need to be immediately able to swing with these or else I'm going to die or I'll have my board wiped or whatever. But Lightning Greaves, I think, is just kind of good. Even getting an extra whatever off of Choco, or even when Choco comes down, being able to immediately equip it and attack to get a trigger off of that. Just putting a card in your hand or land on the battlefield is good enough, and we really want to make sure that we're attacking with our creatures, so having this in here can be nice for that. Or, in certain instances, we do have, birds that can tap for other abilities, so you could, attach this, tap for, Birds of Paradise mana or whatever, and then move this over again. Sort of get pseudo haste on those to be able to use their abilities, but otherwise I just think it's nice to have that out, so when you play a bird for a turn, you get to immediately swing with it on top of everything else, and the protection can also be kind of nice. The Castrals, we kind of talked about a little bit, but a 5 mana 4/5 flyer says whenever one or more birds you control deal combat damage to a player, you can choose one. You put a bird creature card from your hand or graveyard on the battlefield with the finality counter on it, put a +1/+1 counter on each bird you control, or draw a card. So I feel like this is a pretty good bird commander outside of anything else. And that fits really well within our deck, because again, it cares about birds attacking, specifically the combat damage thing, but synergizes with Choco in that way. And then it also allows us to put birds from our hand on the battlefield or from the graveyard. So this is another thing that synergizes with the graveyard, sort of discard effect that Choco has. It does put +1/+1 counters on each bird we control and draws us a card. I feel like all 3 of those are very powerful abilities, especially the +1/+1 counter, honestly, because when we have a big board, each counter you put on is just kind of exponentially better. And, allows us to grow our board big enough to be able to, actually swing for lethal, though the card draw can also be kind of nice as well. Felidar Retreat, so this is another one of our landfall cards. When enters, you can either choose, or when a land you control enters, you can either create a 2/2 white cat beast creature token, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance in turn. So most of the time, it's the second mode, and even in most decks, I mostly care about that second mode. I think it's a lot better. So that's really cool, especially for a Choco trigger. So the Vigilance is nice if we can get it before combat, because we don't actually have to tap over any of our creatures. We can leave a board up while we attack. Though even with Choco's trigger, even if we have to attack first before getting any lands down, during combat we get a pump of our creatures. 2, 3, 4, whatever many lands we end up hitting, and that can matter a whole lot more for swinging and getting more swings in, because we're a little bit safer that way. So that's kind of nice as well. Just all around, another good thing to have. I like a lot of these Lord effects that allow us to pump our whole board. Is just really nice for attacking decks, or the decks that care about sort of being kind of aggro that way. Derevi, sort of probably the most well-known bird commander, mostly because it's kind of nuts. So it has an activated ability that we can not actually use in this deck. You can pay for, put Derevi on the battlefield from the command zone. Of course, he isn't our commander, so that's not going to happen. But he is a flying bird that says whenever it or another creature you control deals combat damage to a player or it enters the battlefield, you may tap or untap target permanent. So this is normally used as a sort of stack piece because you can tap people's permanents or untap your permanents after you've already tapped them, and that's kind of what we're doing with the deck is untapping our stuff. So it's nice because it's another thing that cares about dealing combat damage to our opponents, which is kind of the theme of the deck. But when we're putting lands tapped with Choco's ability, with Derevi, after we've gotten the attack trigger, we deal damage, and then we can untap whatever lands we put into play with Derevi immediately, which I think is really, really cool. Or if we want to kind of give our pseudo vigilance by untapping birds that we want to be able to block with as well. So just kind of all around another card that I think is really great for what we're doing and can give us a whole lot of extra value. And just as a bird, I think does a lot for this deck. Beastmaster Ascension, another one that is sort of a pseudo creator for what we're doing. So it's a 3-mana enchantment that says when a creature you control attacks, you may put a quest counter on it, and then as long as it has 7 or more quest counters on it, creatures you control get +5/+5, which even if you've got 5 creatures, giving your board +25 is nuts. That effect just becomes extremely good. Most of the time with Beastmaster Ascension, I wouldn't say play it until you have at least 7 creatures to attack with, because this is going to be a huge removal target. Most people that have ever seen Beastmaster Ascension played in a deck know that once it gets to 7, you're pretty much dead, or someone at the table is pretty much dead because it's such a huge pump that you get off of it. So kind of waiting, you're like, okay, I have 7 creatures that I can attack with, play Beastmaster Ascension, swing out, immediately turn it on, so you immediately get the pump effect is kind of the best thing there. But again, another card that really cares about us attacking, which I think is really great, but sort of an end game card that allows us to end the game. Banner Kinship. So I like this one over a lot of the other effects that, pump creatures equal to the number of creature types, just because I think this one being non-symmetrical compared to Coat of Arms that gives everything the pump effect. Not as big a deal in this deck because, again, it's like the Urza's Incubator thing where if you run a common creature type, something like a Coat of Arms is a whole lot worse for the deck because you're pumping your opponent's stuff too. But the fact that a lot of our creatures are birds and have some sort of like extra type, like a wizard, a little bit less so, like scout or bard or whatever, we don't as much care about. So a Coat of Arms may not be the worst thing out of the deck because we are running sort of a weird creature type, so we aren't buffing our opponent's stuff. Though even if you are running Coat of Arms in the deck, you kind of got to be wary of what your opponents are playing, because if someone's playing a human tribal or dragon tribal or elf tribal, it's going to be really bad because, again, they just still have a bunch of stuff that synergizes with itself. But if you're the only one at the table that has a tribal deck, I think Coat of Arms is really good, or it kind of just depends on your play group, I would say. But even then, I still think birds even benefit a little bit more off of that because they have the built-in invasion of flying most of the time, that sort of thing. But even then, like those sort of effects are also another reason to run a whole lot more evasion with the deck, like Trample, because we do get a lot of pump effects. But with Banner Kinship specifically, it's a 5-mana artifact that says as it enters, you choose a creature type. This enters with the number of counters equal to the creatures you control the chosen type. So just when it enters, however much stuff you have then, it gets that many counters, and then statically, creatures you control get +1/+1 for each counter on it. So if you've got 5 creatures when you cast this and enters with 5 counters, use your stuff +5/+5, and then it doesn't really matter if your stuff goes up and down like Coat of Arms does. It stays that static whatever many when you first cast it, which I think is kind of nice. So it kind of gets around that board wipe. You can immediately replay stuff and have a huge board. And it's sort of basically the same thing as Beastmaster Ascension most of the time, where you want to play it sort of the turn that you're going to win, or at least a turn that's going to deal you a whole lot of damage. It's not as bad as Beastmaster Ascension because you need 7 creatures to be able to immediately turn it on. But Banner of Kinship, even if you have 3 or 4 creatures out on the battlefield, giving that buff to all of your creatures can be, if you've got 4 creatures, you're giving stuff +16 + sting, or giving your whole board an extra 16 power. So that by itself could be good enough to just run it. And lastly here, sort of our real, I would say, endgame card, sort of our win con is Accruing as well. So it is part of the will cycle, where if you control your commander, you can choose both modes, otherwise you can just choose one. So it's a 4-mana instant that says creatures you control gain flying, vigilance, double strike till end of turn, or creatures you control gain lifelink, indestructible protection from each color till end of turn. So really, you want Choco out, cast this, give your creatures basically everything. They have pro all colors, so they can't be blocked by anything but artifact creatures. They get indestructible, so no matter what they, even if someone has a flying indestructible creature, it doesn't really matter. They gain lifelink, so if you really need the life, just the lifelink by itself I've had be a big enough effect where I'm like, oh, I'm down to a really low life total. I'm going to swing out. I don't really care what dies. I'm gaining life off of this and enough life that I'm going to kind of stabilize. And then really the first one is also really nice. Not only does it give our non-flying birds flying, which is kind of cool, gives them vigilance so we can, again, attack without having to worry about having to give up blockers. And the double strike is kind of the nail in the coffin, where that plus the protection is usually enough to end up killing one or more people at the table. And that's really what we're trying to do, is use this to kill one or more people as sort of our finisher. Besides that, though, you can run a whole lot of other stuff. You could run Critter Hoof straight up in here. I did want to keep this very specifically more centered on birds, because I think that's the most fun thing we can do with this deck, is to have, a lot of the bird stuff in here. That is very much what Choco is built around, and I feel like there's so many commanders that you can just run landfall that I didn't really want to just make another generic landfall good stuff deck. You could go play, any number of like you could just play Tattoo as your commander and then just run a bunch of crap like that. It'd be very easy to do that, so I want to do something a little bit different, kind of go more towards the actual creature type that we don't get to really play around, and they got a lot more love and support with Final Fantasy coming out. But with that being said, I hope all of you have enjoyed this video. Kind of a cool little commander I thought would be kind of fun. It has been surprisingly popular, honestly. I think I built it before I even saw what was going on with all the decks people have been making with it. I think it's pretty fun. If you want kind of a weird creature type and sort of, I would say, a lower power deck, I think this is a really easy one to build. Even if you run a lot of the better bird cards in the deck, it's one of those that sort of has a low ceiling if you're going into that tribe. So if you got a play group that's like, hey, you build really powerful decks, we want to play something, a little bit lower power, I think this is a great commander to go with. But besides that, if you want to take a look at this deck list, I will leave a link to the Moxfield deck in the description below. And if you want to check out any of my other videos I've done on other decks, I will leave a link to that playlist in the description as well. But besides all of that, I will see all of you beautiful people in the next one.